And he began talking about Einstein and said that, chuckling a bit, that he wondered what Einstein was up to on this concern with the sun's radiation, just what business had he with the sun's radiation, and that squared too. And then he said, well, we both have dealt with some reality which we don't entirely understand, but Dr. Einstein found a formula for the release of energy in the physical world, and I have a formula for the release of energy in the ethical world. And just as there was radiation of the sun's light, there's can be radiation of this energy.
Well, this touches on a very important point, namely that until now, the last great exponent of a philosophical point of view that would relate men to the physical world around them, I think you could safely say, was Karl Marx. And Mr. Marx's view is that any unreality simply doesn't exist, that a thing must be real. You have to see it, smell it, feel it, be able to deal with it directly, and that this is the ultimate reality. You now suggest that Dr. Schweitzer and Dr. Einstein go beyond this to an unreality?
Not to an unreality. There is the question that Dr. Heisenberg discussed so much, this matter of the need to define reality, and Dr. Heisenberg's disagreement with the idea that it's only something which is material to which you could apply the term reality, that other things than those which you can substantially identify are real. There are different meanings or significances or frames of reference of this word real, and that these are just as real as a material. Dr. Heisenberg was very critical of the Marxian philosophy, which he said was very naive, and which he felt would be very soon replaced because it was not in accordance with the new physics. And so also Dr. Schweitzer is very much concerned about reality, that our ethics should be an ethics of reality.
Well, here we run into a problem of semantics again. You talk about reality in Dr. Schweitzer's terms. Would this be the reality that the laundress thinks about, for example?
Well, yes, he thinks that anybody, the laundress and so on, if that person will be thoughtful, begins to think about himself and about his relation to the world, and that if he does so, just as inevitably, he used this illustration as if you take a rock and you give it a little push, it'll roll down the hill. And so if you can sort of arouse people out of their thoughtlessness, they will, just by as natural processes almost as that rock rolling down the hill, will arrive at an insight into the nature of reality, which they didn't get out of the purely sensory measurements and so on.
Well, it would be interesting to bring that laundress into this discussion, because I wonder if she would consider the television sets that she lives with and the automobiles and the moving pictures she goes to be something less than reality, and her relationship with them based on thoughtlessness. I wonder if it isn't a question of semantics here. What do you mean by the word reality? As it would have meaning to the laundress. You see, again, there's a gap between what Dr. Schweitzer is saying and what this laundress thinks. Dr. Phillips?
Well, this problem, of course, is the heart of the difficulty. Dr. Schweitzer is extremely sophisticated in this new form of mystical reality, and it has it's nothing that is transcendent or supernatural. It is a reality that can be best seen when all of the dogmas and traditions that have given us our understanding of the nature of the world, the illusions that we hold. And you have to realize that the Marxian view was a sudden interruption in the historical trend where there were mystical realities that were accepted. And in connection with this, Dr. Schweitzer made it quite clear that we are not dealing in our East-West relations with realities. In fact, he was very critical of the way that East and West throw brickbats at one another, and I wonder if Marjorie would tell us a little bit about this East-West relationship as Dr. Schweitzer explained it to us.
Well, we asked him about the East-West crisis ourselves. In fact, we asked, what are we going to do about godless Russia? And in his very perceptive way, he said, oh, let us stop talking about godless and godly and capitalist and communist. These are simply words. In the East and in the West, we are half men looking at half men, and we must both become whole men through thought. Now, I wanted to pick up what Dr. Burke asked for a moment ago when he asked Herb about the laundress. I'm not sure Herb's answer would fit the laundress or not. Many people look for this reality that we've been talking about in the outside world, say, in the universe. But this kind of knowledge requires specific skill, the skill of the science, for instance. Many others look for reality in revelation, and this requires a certain type of skill. But Schweitzer stresses the fact that to find reality, we must first look within, and this is something that all of us can do. The African can do this. The humblest man on earth can do it, or the deepest man on earth. And when we look within, we find reality, which is, I am will to live. And then we look out at the rest of the world and see that there, the rest of the world simply is more will to live. And it's from this central idea, I am will to live in the midst of will to live, that Schweitzer derives his ethics of reverence for life.
Is this really true? Do all groups of people on this planet have this same drive, this same will to live?
Every person can see himself as a will to live related to all will to live if he begins to think. Schweitzer kept saying to us, we must abandon thoughtlessness, we must begin to think, we must become whole men by thought.
What of those theological points of view that are based on the negation of life?
He feels that this is self-contradictory, because all of life does have an outward going feeling. And of course the whole basis of mental illness is this self-contradiction of trying to destroy yourself. I think we know from our own society that when this will to live tries to destroy itself, there is mental illness and there is deviation. And Schweitzer stresses specifically that this will to live must reach out to its own fulfillment and to the fulfillment of all other life.
Well, again, I'm stuck with the semantics here. We're talking about reality. And I just wonder if what you've defined very well here now would be understood as you intended to be understood by, let's say, a Chinese living in one of the most heavily populated parts of China. Let's relate this to the will to live. Let's relate this to the reverence for life. Do you suppose a Chinese in the middle of one of the most heavily populated places on earth would have the same reverence toward life, the same respect for truth, as this is part of the Schweitzer philosophy, as you have here?
Well, I happen to be Chinese. My name is Marjorie Chan Gable, so it's appropriate. And I stand between the East and West in another sense. Certainly, the Chinese thinkers, whom Schweitzer admires very deeply, have had this passion for life. And he distinguishes the Chinese thinkers in their ethics from, for instance, the older Indian thinkers who did try to escape from life. But it was the Chinese thinkers who wanted to reach out to all life. Now, you ask about the man in the city. Schweitzer used a very beautiful illustration of the man in the city in his talk with us. He said, when you look at a man on a city street, ask him, do you have a bed to sleep in tonight? Now, it's this kind of elemental thinking, of elemental thought that Schweitzer is concerned with. There is an old Chinese saying, when you reach someone on the street, you ask him, have you had your rice today? And this kind of concern for the need of the other individual, I think, is quite common to all people if they begin to think.
Dr. Phillips?
I think at this point, I think it's very important that we try eventually to get to the philosophy, but I think it might be interesting to have Dr. Norris give us an interpretation of Dr. Schweitzer's mental acuity and vigor and penetrating powers in this stage of his life. And Dr. Norris had a very exciting experience with Dr. Schweitzer, and I think it might be well to realize that we are dealing with an intellect that is still extremely capable.
Well, I think it's quite instructive that here's a man that's 86 years old today, who's been in Africa for 47 years, has been working on some of these problems of semantics and interpretation of the will to live all that time. You might expect that a man of that age might be somewhat dulled by the struggle, by the fact of his age. This is not true. You might expect that he would have come to some answers now that he didn't have at the age of 40, roughly when he went down there. But strangely, that isn't the case either. He was asked whether, if he were to start again in Africa, the program which he has followed for the last 47 years, would he do anything differently than he did before, and his answer was no. But I think this has a clue to what you were saying about semantics. He is basically a kind of philosophical and theological agnostic. He studied all these isms for many years and has very acute and direct answers he can give about all of them. But he says, for sure, I cannot say whether God exists or not, whether immortality takes place or not, whether nature is purposive or not. These are questions I can't answer. But I can say that I feel the will to live. Now, that doesn't mean, though, that man shouldn't wrestle with these problems, whether nature is purposive or God exists or whatever. He must continue to wrestle, and he is still wrestling himself at the age of 86 with these same questions. He says, don't put them up on the shelf, but keep on working with these Geheimnisse, he said, these secrets of nature, because a man's life is fulfilled as he struggles with them. Sein Leben ist erfüllt. His life is fulfilled. It sort of reaches its destiny. Man matures and makes the most of his life, realizes his greatest potential as he struggles with these problems. Well, this, I think, is the vitality of his life at this age, having struggled all these years, points then to the real root of his whole existence, which is this ethical concern, which is as great and more articulated, actually, now than it was when he began.
Well, now, this ethical articulation, his point of view about ethics, has been largely formulated in Lamborghini in Africa. This is not to suggest that he hadn't thought about this or worked on it before, but yes, it's been largely worked out in a faraway place, yeah, far removed from the realities, get back to that word again, of Europe, the Western world, or those parts of the world where most of the problems exist, to which Schweitzer's ethics must be applied. I'm very curious to know how one goes about applying an ethical concept worked out in isolation away from these places to people who are up to their ears in these problems day by day. How do you do this?
Well, it might be deduced that he doesn't actually know what the problems are in Europe because he's lived down there when he worked this out. Well, that certainly is not the case, because he receives volumes of mail, just hundreds of letters, almost daily. He subscribes to journals from the leading countries of Europe and America, so he's very well informed. But he says it's really an advantage to him to be able to work down there in the primeval forest because he's not interrupted by all the noise and hubbub of the complex civilization of Europe or America. But he says, sure, the institutions of Europe, the states, the churches, the civil groups, the clubs that people belong to, are a part of their life. But the answers to a good society are not going to be offered by them, because they tend to become ends in themselves that demand that people serve them instead of that they derive their life from the people that make them up. So he says a man can work on this problem anywhere. And this is the kind of answer that is needed everywhere, whether it's in the primeval forest of Africa or the metropolitan area of New York City or London.
Ms. Scoville.
Well, I'd like to pick up that idea of reality. If you think that reality is not present in Africa, you have quite a surprise. I was very excited about going to the jungle. I thought I would love it, and I had no idea how in close contact I would feel with the nakedness of reality, if you please, as I did in Africa. And this is Schweitzer's experience I'm sure you all know the illustration of the fact that he was wrestling with these problems that Lewis suggested. And only when he was going up the river on an errand of mercy and he saw hippopotamuses, or hippopotami, if you will, in the river Agawi, that he realized this passion, this urge, this striving, this playfulness was the will to live. I felt it keenly as I looked at Africa, because most of the people that we served down there are diseased. They're in pain. They have all kinds of anguishes. And in our sophisticated society, we might think, well, why don't they just give up and die? But they don't. They want to live more than anything else in the world. And I think that this contact with this kind of naked reality highlighted Schweitzer's sense of values about the will to live.
Well, Ms. Goebel, at this point, I think it would be most appropriate if one of you, perhaps you can take off at this point. I'd like to have you carry Schweitzer's ideas about thinking as they relate to religion, as they relate to a reverence for life, as they relate to all those things that must be understood if this reality I'm trying to get at is to be understood. Would you care to start?
Well, thinking is very important to Schweitzer. We, as the eggheads that we were, wanted to talk to him about rationalism. And we wanted to prove in a way that all these skills that we've accumulated over the many years that we have all studied somehow fitted us better for this process. And he kept saying, no, don't talk about rationalism at this point, but talk about thought. And of course, Schweitzer takes thinking about oneself from the inside out to its natural conclusion, where you can no longer see a reason for your own existence. You can merely say, I am will to live. And then as you look out on the world, you see the whole world consisting of other wills to live, and you feel a union, may I say a mysticism, with this other life. And we felt this in the jungle. Many of us had been in the jungle for the first time on this trip. And this unity that we felt with all life, although it was entirely different, the animal life, the human life that we saw seemed quite different in appearance and in nature from our own, but we felt at one with it.
You use the word unity and union, and then you relate it to mysticism. Are you suggesting that union and unity can't be defined, that there is something indefinable about this?
I would say it's an experience. Schweitzer would certainly say that this is an experience, this union with all other life.
And this part,
the mystical thing.
This part of Schweitzer's philosophy then can't be reduced to A, B, C.
No, it cannot.
Well, I think it can. I would think that it can be reduced to ABCs. In fact, it was reduced to something less than that. Two of our members of our safari had really a serious experience with an invasion of ants. That where this will to live of the ants was being demonstrated most successfully, and it just happens that I have enough deceit in my soul, I suppose, to have taken a can of insecticide with me in a covering, so it couldn't be seen, I'll confess. And in the middle of the night, I heard the uproar in the little cubicle adjacent to mine, and it seemed like an indecency to have the night disturbed this way. And so I went over and I saw my neighbors fighting with the most phenomenal invasion of ants that you have ever seen. They were brushing them off, and they pulled up the mattress, and it looked as if the ants could carry the mattress off. There were literally millions upon millions of these little wills to live, hunting for nothing more than sustenance. Some of this imported delicacy from the north apparently attracted them, but the wills to live of my neighbors forgot for the moment about reverence for life. Now, I had difficulties with bites for 5 days, and had rejected the use of my insecticide that was at my fingertips. But at this point, the neighbors called on me and said, "Do you have something?" And I said, "Yes, I do." And so with this spray, they claim that they chased the ants away. But I saw some on their backs struggling for air and breath. And they both would like to speak to this point.
Well,
sure.
Dr. Norris,
Well, I might say that the engagement with the ants had something to tell us about the question you've been raising about what is reality. It seems to me that we were very sure they were real. For the sake of our discussion, I think for understanding Schweitzer, the term reality could be used to refer to what actively affects you. This could be quite a number of things. So whether it's a rock that falls on your toe, you know that has affected you. If it's an idea that bumps into you that someone has sent to you, it affects you, either you accept it or not. If it's an ant that bites you, it affects you. If your own will is acting, you are somehow within the frame of awareness, alert to the fact that here is something going on. It is affecting something, or something is involved in changing from one stage to another. So you cannot avoid that. You can't jump out of your will. You can't cease being aware of the fact that you are acting. So there you hit bottom, and beyond which there is none. And therefore you move from that, whether it be Chinese or American or French or German. You move out from that to explore all around the horizon, all other things that are acting or affecting you. They are the realities with which you must deal. And any philosophy that jumps then from the experience of these things that are affecting you to something you postulate or propose to be real, though it isn't affecting you, is for Schweitzer then invention and something you should avoid.
Well, Dr. Norris, let me suggest that we examine two kinds of bottom, to use your own expression. You hit bottom of a reality in a country where there's a great deal of elbow room, where you have a great deal of space between people, where there's a great deal of land in which to think freely, behave freely politically, socially, and economically. And you hit bottom in a country where there is no room, where by virtue of numbers of people, again, you think differently about things. This is why I raise the point of thought as it relates to this matter of religion and reverence for life. Isn't it possible that you take off from different bottoms to think differently about totally different values in religion, all the way up?
Well, you might think differently in the sense that the pattern of action which you discover to be appropriate in relation to the things that affect you would be different, say, in New York than it might be in Lamborghini. But the problem is no different, and the procedure is no different. You begin with the same recognition of activity. Things are affecting me. In New York, then, the relation between you and other people that affect you on Fifth Avenue and 42nd Street would be very different than it would be in the primeval forest in Lamborghini. But the problem is the same. What do you do about it? Whether it's ants biting you or people shoving you off the bus when you want to get on Fifth Avenue and 42nd Street.
Well, thank you, Dr. Norris. May I ask a layman to comment on this? Would you care to, Mrs. Staver?
Yes, I certainly would. I have been happy to see that this discussion was finally getting to include the word experience. As a layman, of course, I was most interested, having read Dr. Schweitzer's philosophy, to see if at Lamborghini truly this philosophy was carried over into life through the experience. Now, I, like Marjorie and several of us, had not been to Africa before. I was catapulted into many different experiences of relationship. And I think in order to understand Dr. Schweitzer, we do have to understand relationships. We have had relationships with each other on this trip, and then going to Lamborghini, we found that there was something extremely basic about the kind of feeling that was projected, emanating in the beginning from the doctor. He met us at the dock and helped each one of us off of the boat. We immediately were made part of the family. There were feelings that you could have flowing from each of the nurses, each of the members of the staff, who, although they were individuals in their own right, were so concerned with other people's welfare that it was something that was felt within the room. We very fortunately arrived on New Year's Eve in the daytime, of course, and were able to share in the family celebration at midnight. the great bells tolled, the candles were lighted down this long table, and all of the staff bowed their heads. I'm sure they were thinking that someday the doctor wouldn't be with them when those bells tolled. But this unusual feeling of concern was carried through our evening meals as we sat around the tables, as we sang hymns with the doctor playing the piano after the evening meal. They were carried over when he met with us in Symposium. He was perfectly delightful. He was joking, he was warm, he was, didn't each of us feel that there was a special relationship that we had with him?
Well, may I ask at this point, would it be correct then to say that Dr. Schweitzer believes that the spread of his point of view must be based on this relationship example that you've just given us? That I understand that Dr. Schweitzer does not think too highly of institutions or organizations for the promulgation of anything. But in this case, then, Dr. Schweitzer will spread his philosophy through the kind of personal relationship that you saw at first hand in Lamborghini.
The personal, individual relationship. First, we have to get away from thoughtlessness, as the scholars have said. We have to think into ourselves. And then we, through experience, and have a personal relationship with each individual life that touches our life. And it is through this personal relationship that we come to an understanding of reverence for life.
This is a form of organization, a very simple, primitive one. What do you think, as a layman, what do you think the chances are that this form of spreading an idea will compete successfully either with the institution of communism or the institution of democracy, as these two forces are operating in Africa as everywhere else?
Well,
do you see this as a third force?
Yes. Well, I can, of course, on a long-term basis, I feel that the problem is educational in nature. I don't mean institutionally, but in that as we relate to very young children and help them to develop a sense of their own worth, then they can understand and relate to other life. This is one way. I don't think that I would have the knowledge to say how this would work on a short-term basis, where we are faced with these terrific problems of trying to help the world come to an understanding in such a short time.
Now, let me see. When did Dr. Schweitzer come to Lamborghini?
Let's see, when was it?
1913.
Mm-hmm.
This was several years before another group with a different philosophical point of view came to power in old Russia.
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Schweitzer has been working at his philosophy using his method for approximately the same length of time. I don't want to draw any conclusions, but almost 1/3 of the world's real estate, about half its people, are now subject to one philosophy. How effectively do you suppose Dr. Schweitzer's philosophy stands against this performance?
Well, of course, it was years and years and years before Dr. Schweitzer felt impelled to do anything in the world about this. Isn't that right, Dr. Phillips, that he wrote his books and he lived in his Lamborghini, and it's only been since there has been the atomic crisis that he has felt that he would relate more to the institutions
Well,
of the
surely
world.
not in terms of this relationship example that you used earlier. Dr. Schweitzer has been living this kind
He's
of
been
relationship from the beginning.
living it, yes.
Dr. Norris, you had something you wanted to say on this.
Well, we're speculating, of course. And it's hard to tell just what the effect will be in the future. But it's very interesting to compare, though, the fact that Jesus, in his time, did not himself set up any formal organization. It was the Roman Empire that was the pattern within which he worked. And his own thought, though, has outlived the Roman Empire and encircled the world in a way in which Roman life did not. And that's the problem we now face. Will this point of view interpenetrate political structures without the kind of formal organization which he fears, and still have a lasting effect that will outrun communism when it has run its course? As I say, we're speculating. I don't see how you can answer that very adequately.
That's a fair answer. Dr.
Except
Phillips?
that, excuse me.
Dr. Phillips.
Well, I think you launched onto the analysis that is very appropriate to the Schweitzer revolution. I think you suggested at the beginning of the program that knowledge has come to man from two sources. Essentially, one's capacity to know the objective world through sensory experience, or sensory objective knowledge, and what is revealed to one by an inward look at reality as it can be seen and felt within the heart or within the center of one's consciousness. Now, Dr. Schweitzer's revolution is that he is agnostic about the truths that come to us through our sensory experiences, even as they have been extended by science. The concept of an experienced reality is the sovereign reality to Dr. Schweitzer. This is, if you will, a mystical reality because it can't be made into the form of models. You can't weigh love. You can't weigh reverence or wisdom. And yet these things are extremely motivating to men. Now, the revolution between East and West today is precisely this. Precisely the knowledge of the molecular physical world as it was conceived to be true in the 19th century by Newtonian physicists. The whole structure of communist thought depends upon molecular reality as these aggregates are extended to become macromolecules and then cells and finally multicellular organisms and eventually man, who has a deterministic history that ends up with communism as its final dialectical goal. Now, this scientific reality came into the feudal system of Europe and smashed it to